I didn't know my life was about to fracture quietly across a dinner table. Not with a scream, not with betrayal in the traditional sense, but with laughter. The kind that isn't meant for you, yet somehow lands directly on your chest. My name is Marissa, I'm 32 years old, and I'm married to a man I love deeply. But in my husband Daniel's family, love doesn't earn you a seat at the table. It earns you a label. And mine has always been the quiet one, the harmless one, the one who works with computers, the one who should be grateful just to be there. If you've ever sat in a room full of people who smile while slowly erasing you, you'll understand what that feels like. Sunday dinners at my mother-in-law's house weren't about food. They were performances, auditions for approval that I never signed up for. Crystal glasses clinking, perfect napkins folded into shapes no one needed, and conversations designed not to connect, but to rank. Every week, I sat there smiling politely while being reduced to a punchline I never volunteered for. And I let it happen because I loved my husband, because I didn't want to embarrass him, because I told myself it's not worth it. Until the night someone laughed at me, and I realized everyone else at the table was laughing with them. That was the night I understood something dangerous. They didn't underestimate me by accident. They underestimated me because I let them. And the worst part, they had no idea who they were talking to. They didn't know that while they were mocking my job, I was finalizing a deal worth more than everything they bragged about combined. They didn't know that silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. And they definitely didn't know that the woman they treated like background noise was about to become the loudest truth they'd ever have to face. Because sometimes the most satisfying reckoning doesn't come from revenge. It comes from finally turning on the lights and watching everyone realize they've been laughing in the dark. Before I became the quiet one at Daniel's family dinners, I was someone else entirely. I was Marissa Hale, 32 years old, senior back-end engineer, the kind of woman who learned early that competence spoke louder than charm. I grew up in a middle-class household where affection was practical, not performative. My parents didn't clap for ambition, they expected it. You worked hard, you kept your word, you didn't brag because results had a way of showing up on their own. That mindset shaped me. I wasn't loud, I wasn't flashy, but I was precise. I liked systems, order, logic, the quiet satisfaction of building something invisible that still held everything together. Daniel came into my life during a phase when I wasn't looking for anyone. We met at a friend's birthday gathering. Not romantic, not cinematic. He spilled a drink on my shoes and apologized like it was a moral failure. That should have been my first clue. He was gentle, attentive, the kind of man who listened without interrupting, who didn't compete for attention because he'd never learned to measure his worth that way. Daniel worked in operations management, steady and reliable. He liked early mornings, black coffee, and believed deeply in showing up for people. He wasn't dramatic, he wasn't arrogant. He was safe, in the best sense of the word. And after years of navigating male egos disguised as confidence, that felt like oxygen. We built our relationship slowly. Late-night conversations that drifted into morning. Shared routines. Shared silences that never felt awkward. When he proposed, it wasn't extravagant. No flash mobs. No social media spectacle. Just a ring he'd carefully chosen. Hands slightly shaking as he asked if I'd build a life with him. I said yes, without hesitation. What I didn't fully understand then was that I wasn't just marrying Daniel. I was marrying his family's expectations. His mother, Patricia, came from a world where image was currency, where dinners were curated, achievements were displayed, and success was only real if it was visible. She had raised Daniel and his sister in an environment where approval was conditional, earned through presentation, not authenticity. The first time I met her, she hugged me with a smile that never reached her eyes and asked, "So, what exactly do you do, dear?" When I explained my work, infrastructure systems, automation, back-end logic, she nodded politely. "Oh," she said, "computers." That was it. From that moment on, I was categorized. Not impressive, not embarrassing, just background. Her husband, Richard, was polite but distant, a retired finance professional who spoke in metaphors about golf and markets like they were universal truths. He didn't dislike me. He simply didn't understand how typing could be a career. In his world, success wore suits and talked loudly. And then there was Jessica, Daniel's younger sister, 26, beautiful, confident, always in motion. She reinvented herself every few months. Wellness consultant, lifestyle coach, brand strategist. Each pivot came with new Instagram captions and supportive applause from the family. Every boyfriend was introduced like a press release, and I watched quietly as enthusiasm was rewarded while substance went unnoticed. At first, I tried. I dressed carefully. I smiled more. I laughed at jokes that weren't funny. I convinced myself that adaptation was maturity. Daniel would squeeze my hand under the table and whisper, "They mean well." And because I loved him, I believed that. But over time, I started shrinking without realizing it. I spoke less, corrected nothing, let comments slide. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I didn't want to become the problem. What I didn't realize was this: silence doesn't buy peace. It just teaches people how much they can take. And by the time I noticed how invisible I'd become, everyone else had already gotten used to it. Looking back, the warning signs weren't subtle. They were just consistent. They showed up in the way Daniel's family spoke around me instead of to me, in the way conversations accelerated the moment I tried to contribute, like my words were speed bumps everyone was eager to drive over. At first, I told myself it was cultural. They were louder, more competitive, more opinionated. I was different, not inferior. That's what I kept repeating in my head during Sunday dinners, where Patricia orchestrated the evening like a general running drills. The lighting was always perfect. The food arrived on schedule, and the conversations followed a hierarchy no one acknowledged out loud. Richard talked, people listened, Jessica performed. People praised, Patricia evaluated, people adjusted. And me? I existed in the margins. "Marissa's so calm," Patricia would say, slicing into a roast with surgical precision. I admire women who don't feel the need to dominate conversations. It sounded like a compliment. It wasn't. When Jessica announced she was launching yet another wellness brand, everyone leaned in like she'd cured a disease. When I mentioned I was leading a major system overhaul for an international logistics firm, Richard nodded and asked if that meant I fixed printers. I laughed it off. I always laughed it off. Daniel noticed, but not enough to intervene. He believed in harmony, in not rocking boats that had been floating for decades. And I understood that impulse. I really did. So when Patricia started assigning me helpful tasks during dinners, troubleshooting the Wi-Fi, setting up playlists, fixing someone's phone, I complied. It was easier than pushing back. But each small concession chipped away at something. The jokes sharpened. "Must be nice working from home," Patricia said once, "taking breaks whenever you want." I smiled and didn't mention the 3 a.m. client calls or the 70-hour weeks. "Do you ever miss having a real office?" Richard asked another time. "Somewhere more structured?" I nodded politely, like structure wasn't the foundation of everything I built. And then there were the moments that stung just enough to linger. At a charity event, Patricia introduced Daniel with pride, his role, his accomplishments, his future. When she gestured toward me, she smiled brightly. "And this is Marissa," she said. "She works with computers. Not at a company, not as an engineer, just with computers." Someone patted my arm and told me, "Good for you, sweetie." I went home that night and cried in the shower so Daniel wouldn't hear. I didn't tell him. I told myself I was being sensitive, that it wasn't worth turning into a fight. But the tension kept building. The family group chat, the winners, buzzed constantly with inside jokes, celebrations, photos I wasn't in. When I did respond, my messages were ignored or reacted to with a thumbs up. Minimal acknowledgement, maximum distance. The breaking point didn't arrive as an explosion. It crept in quietly, disguised as anticipation. Jessica announced she was bringing a new boyfriend to dinner. Again. "This one's different," Daniel said, hopeful. "He's in finance." I didn't say anything. I just felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the sense that once again, I was about to be measured against someone who spoke louder, bragged better, and fit the aesthetic of success they worshipped. I told myself to behave, to stay quiet, to survive another evening. What I didn't know was that this time, silence wouldn't protect me, because the moment he walked through the door, smiling like he owned the room, I realized something was off. And once you see that kind of thing, you can't unsee it. The first thing I noticed about Trevor was how comfortable he was being admired. He entered Patricia's house like someone stepping onto a stage he'd rehearsed for. Suit tailored just enough to suggest success without effort, smile calibrated for approval. The kind of man who shook hands as if every interaction might turn into a negotiation. "Marissa," he said, gripping my hand firmly, "I've heard a lot about you." I smiled. "None of it concerning, I hope." He laughed loudly, not because the joke was funny, but because laughter filled space. And in that family, space was power. Patricia beamed at him like she'd personally vetted his resume. Richard leaned in immediately, asking about markets and trends. Jessica glowed, basking in reflected validation. And just like that, the room rearranged itself around him. Dinner began with the usual choreography. Wine poured, compliments exchanged. Jessica narrated her relationship like a press release. "Trevor works in hedge funds," she said proudly. "Portfolio optimization, analytics." Richard perked up. "Finance, huh? Now that's real work." Trevor nodded modestly. "We try." I focused on my plate. Then Patricia turned to me. "And you, Marissa," she said sweetly. "Still doing tech things?" There it was. I felt the familiar urge to deflect, to joke, to minimize, to keep the peace. "Yes," I said calmly. "Still building systems." Trevor leaned toward me, curious. "What kind of systems?" "Back-end infrastructure," I replied. "Logistics automation." He nodded slowly, like someone pretending to understand a foreign language. "So, websites?" I smiled politely. "If NASA built websites for grocery stores." A few chuckles. Polite ones. Trevor grinned. "Hey, everyone starts somewhere." Something in his tone shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The conversation flowed, but the undercurrent changed. Trevor talked about disrupting industries, about mindset, about how finance was where real decisions happened. He sprinkled buzzwords like confetti, and the table ate it up. Then he told a story. "Funny thing," he said, swirling his wine. "I once met this guy who built some app, made like $7, and thought he was the next tech genius. That's the problem with tech people. They live in fantasy land." The table laughed. Jessica giggled. Patricia covered her mouth, amused. Richard shook his head knowingly. Even Daniel laughed, nervously, instinctively. And then Trevor looked directly at me. "You ever try something like that, Marissa?" The room went quiet. Not silent. Attentive, waiting. I felt heat crawl up my neck. My hands tightened around my fork. For a split second, I considered laughing it off, like I always did. But something inside me shifted. I realized I was tired. Tired of shrinking. Tired of being polite. Tired of being the punchline no one defended. So I smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. "I did," I said evenly. "Once made $9. A ripple of laughter. "Inflation," I added. Trevor smirked. "At least you've got backup options. I know someone who teaches coding to high schoolers." The laughter grew louder. And that's when it hit me. They weren't laughing with me. They were laughing at me. What none of them knew, what Trevor definitely didn't know, was that earlier that week, I'd signed a 7-figure contract with a global firm his company had been desperately trying to impress. I raised my glass. "To thriving," I said calmly. Trevor clinked his against mine, grinning. completely unaware that he'd just insulted the woman whose company controlled his biggest opportunity. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't correcting someone. It's letting them keep talking, because every word they say digs the hole deeper. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was angry. Anger would have been easier. Anger burns hot, then fades. What I felt was heavier. It sat in my chest like a question I'd been avoiding for years. Why didn't anyone stop him? Daniel lay beside me, breathing evenly, already asleep. I watched the ceiling fan rotate in slow circles, each turn pulling another memory to the surface. The laughter, the way his joke had landed, the silence that followed. Not awkward, not uncertain, but accepting. I replayed the moment over and over, wondering where exactly things had gone wrong. Had I encouraged it? By staying quiet, by smiling, by letting people underestimate me because it felt safer than being misunderstood. I turned onto my side, facing Daniel's back. He hadn't meant to hurt me. I knew that. He was conflict avoidant in the way people raised by dominant personalities often are. Peace to him meant no raised voices, no scenes, no disruption. But peace built on my silence wasn't peace. It was permission. The next morning, over coffee, he glanced at me carefully. "You okay?" he asked. I considered lying. Instead, I said, "I didn't like last night." He sighed, rubbing his temples. Trevor was joking. About me. He jokes about everyone. "No," I said softly. "He jokes at people he thinks are smaller than him." Daniel hesitated. "You could have said something." I met his eyes. "I shouldn't have had to." That landed differently. He nodded slowly, guilt flickering across his face. "I'm sorry. I should have stepped in." I believed him. But belief didn't erase the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding since the early days of our marriage. What happens when I stop shrinking? The following days were a blur of work. Calls, deadlines, decisions. I immersed myself in systems and logic because they responded honestly. They didn't laugh at the wrong moments. They didn't pretend not to see. Then the message came. "Patricia, dinner Sunday, 6 p.m. Dress appropriately." No warmth. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Just expectation. Daniel looked at me hopefully. "We should go." I stared at the screen. Something inside me hardened. "Okay," I said, "but I'm not pretending this time." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm done covering for people who disrespect me." Dinner that Sunday felt different the moment we walked in. Trevor was there again. Confident, polished, unchanged. And for the first time, I didn't brace myself. I observed. Listened. Watched the way he spoke. Vague when pressed, inflated when praised. Watched how Patricia nodded eagerly, how Richard leaned forward, how Jessica glowed beside him. And then he said it. Casually. Carelessly. "So, Marissa," he asked, swirling his wine, "what do you actually do?" The table went quiet again, but this time, I didn't feel small. I felt clear. "I run a software company," I said calmly. "We build predictive logistics platforms." Trevor nodded. "Right, Flowstream or something?" My fork froze mid-air. Flowstream. "My company. The one your firm's trying to acquire," I said evenly. His smile faltered. I pulled out my phone, scrolled once, and placed it on the table. Marissa Hale, CEO, Flowstream Technologies. The silence this time was different. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't amused. It was stunned. And for the first time in that dining room, I wasn't invisible. For a moment, no one spoke. Not Patricia, not Richard, not even Jessica. The only sound in the room was the soft clink of someone setting down a glass. I think it was Daniel's hand shaking just enough to give him away. Trevor stared at my phone like it might contradict me if he waited long enough. "That must be a different Flowstream," he said finally, laughing too quickly. "Common name." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Predictive Logistics," I said evenly. "Founded in 2019. Recently finalized a 7-figure enterprise contract with a global distribution firm." Richard let out a low whistle. Patricia's gaze snapped to Trevor. "You said your firm was handling that acquisition." "We are," Trevor said, a beat too late. "Just indirectly. I'm not the lead. Jessica frowned. You told me you were running point. Trevor shifted in his chair. It's complicated. I smiled. Not cruelly, not triumphantly, just honestly. Finance always is, I said, especially when people confuse proximity with authority. That did it. The illusion cracked. Richard leaned back, folding his arms. So you don't actually work on the deal? Because, Richard continued, if you did, you'd know FlowStream isn't just some tech thing. It's a major asset. Trevor's jaw tightened. Patricia cleared her throat. Marissa, why didn't you ever mention this? I met her eyes. You never asked. The words landed harder than I expected. Jessica looked between us, realization dawning. Wait, so all those jokes about her job? Her voice trailed off. Daniel reached for my hand under the table, squeezing gently. Support. Finally. Trevor tried to recover. Look, he said, forcing a smile. I respect what you've built. Startups are risky, though. Most fail. Yes, I agreed, which is why lying about them is so strange. The table froze. That was the moment the atmosphere shifted. Not toward me, but away from him. Jessica pushed her chair back slightly. You told me you were a senior partner. I said I worked with partners. That's not the same thing. Patricia's voice was tight. Trevor, we value honesty in this family. I almost laughed. He glanced at me, sharp, defensive. You didn't have to embarrass me. I held his gaze. I didn't embarrass you. I stopped protecting you. The silence stretched. Finally, Jessica stood. I think we should go. Trevor followed her out, muttering under his breath. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the cutlery. No one moved. Patricia exhaled slowly. That was unfortunate. Unfortunate? I asked calmly. Or inconvenient? She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. You could have handled that privately, she said. And you could have shut it down the first time he mocked me, I replied. We all make choices. Richard surprised everyone by chuckling. Kid talked more buzzwords than my last broker. Patricia shot him a look. Richard. What? He said. She's not wrong. Daniel squeezed my hand again. The rest of the meal passed in stiff silence. No dessert. No forced pleasantries. When we left, the night air felt lighter than the house ever had. In the car, Daniel finally spoke. You didn't do anything wrong. I leaned back against the seat, exhausted but steady. I know. And for the first time since marrying into his family, I felt something shift. Not just in them, but in me. I wasn't shrinking anymore. I was standing exactly where I'd always belonged. The fallout didn't arrive loudly. It crept in through silence. The next morning, my phone stayed still. No group chat notifications, no passive-aggressive memes, no good morning family messages pretending nothing had happened. Just absence. Daniel left early for work. He kissed my forehead like always, but his eyes lingered a second longer than usual. Worried, uncertain, as if he were walking into a world where I'd unknowingly changed the rules. I worked from home that day, but my focus splintered. Code blurred, logic slipped. My mind kept drifting back to the dinner table, to Patricia's face when the truth landed, to Jessica's shock, to the way the room had gone cold around Trevor. I told myself I felt relieved, but relief isn't the same as peace. By noon, the messages started. Not to me, about me. Daniel's phone buzzed constantly. I didn't need to see the screen to know who it was. He'd sigh, type a few words, stop, erase them, try again. Finally, he sat across from me at the kitchen table. They're upset, he said carefully. I noticed. They think you humiliated Jessica. I tilted my head. By telling the truth? They think you made a scene. I let out a slow breath. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult him. I corrected a lie. Daniel rubbed his face. You know how my mom is. Optics matter to her. There it was. The word that always seemed to matter more than anything else. Optics. So where do I fit in those optics? I asked quietly. Am I a wife or am I a liability? He didn't answer right away. That hurt more than any joke ever had. The rest of the week unfolded like a low-grade fever, subtle, persistent, draining. Patricia sent Daniel a message asking to talk privately. Jessica unfollowed me on social media. The family group chat remained silent, the digital equivalent of being sent to your room. At night, Daniel grew quieter, not distant, just torn. I could see it in the way he hesitated before speaking, and how carefully he chose his words. And for the first time since we'd married, I wondered something terrifying. What if standing up for myself cost me my marriage? That thought followed me into the early hours of the morning, when the house was dark and Daniel slept beside me, unaware of the calculations running through my mind. I wasn't afraid of losing his family. I was afraid of losing him because I finally stopped disappearing. By Friday, Patricia made her move. She didn't text me. She summoned me. Lunch, 1 p.m., just us. No emojis, no softness. A confrontation dressed up as civility. I stared at the message for a long time. This was the moment. The one where I'd either fold, apologize, smooth things over, shrink back into the version of myself they preferred, or I'd say what I'd been holding in for years. I didn't know which version of my life waited on the other side of that lunch. I only knew one thing. I was done pretending that silence was strength. And whatever happened next, I would finally be honest. The restaurant Patricia chose was exactly what I expected. Minimalist decor, white tablecloths, the kind of place where silence was expensive and every glass of water came with lemon and judgment. A room designed for control, not comfort. She was already seated when I arrived, posture perfect, hands folded like this was a board meeting instead of an ambush. "Marissa," she said, smiling thinly, "thank you for coming." "My therapist says I need more emotional challenges," I replied, taking my seat. She didn't laugh. We ordered without looking at menus. Her salad without dressing, mine with whatever the waiter recommended. Small power plays disguised as habits. Once the waiter left, Patricia leaned forward. "We need to discuss your behavior." I met her gaze calmly. "Which part? The honesty or the refusal to lie for someone else?" Her eyes narrowed. "You embarrassed my daughter. I protected her. You humiliated her boyfriend. He humiliated himself." She exhaled sharply. "You don't understand how families like ours function." "No," I agreed. "I understand how this family avoids accountability." The words sat between us, heavy, undeniable. Patricia's voice dropped. "Reputation matters. My connections, my board positions. This kind of drama damages what we've built." "And lying protects it?" I asked. "Or does it just delay the collapse?" She stiffened. "You could have handled this privately." "You mean quietly," I said. "And I've been quiet for years." She paused. That was new. I continued, voice steady. "I sat through dinners being dismissed, mocked, reduced to a joke. And every time I stayed silent. For Daniel, for harmony, for optics." Her lips pressed together. "But silence doesn't buy peace," I said. "It buys permission." Patricia studied me, really studied me, as if reassessing a variable she'd miscalculated. "You think you're better than us," she said finally. "No," I replied softly. "I think I'm done proving I belong." That landed. She leaned back, crossing her arms. "You're lucky my son loves you." I smiled gently. "And you're lucky he chose someone who doesn't confuse truth with disrespect." For the first time since I'd met her, Patricia didn't immediately respond. She looked tired. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted, quieter, less rehearsed. "I built this family on standards," she said, "on control, because control kept us safe." I nodded. Control also suffocates. Silence. Then, unexpectedly, she sighed. "I spoke to my board," she admitted, "about Trevor." I raised an eyebrow. "They confirmed what you implied," she said reluctantly. "He exaggerated his role, considerably." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply said, "I'm sorry Jessica had to find out that way." Patricia looked at me sharply. "You meant that?" "Yes." Something in her expression softened, just a fraction. "I don't like how it happened," she said, "but I can't deny you were right." That was it. The turning point. Not an apology, but an acknowledgement. And for this woman, that was monumental. When lunch ended, she stood first. "This doesn't make us friends," she said. "I wasn't aiming for that," I replied. But as she walked away, she paused. "Marissa," she said without turning, "you're stronger than I thought." I smiled to myself. So am I. The fallout didn't explode. It unraveled. Quietly. Inevitably. By the following week, the story had shifted. No longer whispered, no longer protected. The same people who once laughed along with Trevor's confidence began asking questions they should have asked months ago. Jessica stopped defending him. At first, she tried to rationalize, said everyone exaggerates, that finance was complicated, that maybe she misunderstood his role. But lies don't survive daylight, and once the board confirmations reached her, there was nothing left to hold on to. She ended it without ceremony. No dramatic post, no inspirational caption, just silence. Patricia withdrew from her charity circuit for the first time in years. Meetings postponed, appearances declined. When people asked why, she said she needed to refocus. Translation: damage control. Richard, surprisingly, became my unexpected ally. He called Daniel midweek, voice low but amused. "Kid had more buzzwords than balance sheets," he said. "Should have trusted my gut." Daniel relayed that to me with a half smile. "He said you remind him of people who actually get things done." I exhaled, something loosening in my chest. The family group chat reactivated days later. No memes, no sarcasm, just logistics. "Dinner Friday? Let us know if you're coming." No demands, no instructions. When Daniel showed me the message, he watched my face carefully. "You don't have to go," he said. "I know," I replied, "but I want to." That surprised him. Friday night felt different, quieter, softer. Patricia greeted us without her usual performance. No exaggerated compliments, no veiled assessments, just a nod, respectful, measured. Jessica avoided my eyes at first, then approached me in the kitchen. "I owe you an apology," she said awkwardly. "I should have listened." I nodded. "We all ignore red flags when we want something to work." She exhaled. "I won't do that again." I believed her. Dinner passed without spectacle, without competition, without ranking. No one joked about my job. No one asked me to fix the Wi-Fi. And when I spoke, people listened. Not because I demanded it, but because I no longer needed it. The most telling moment came at the end of the night. As we were leaving, Patricia touched my arm gently. "You don't have to prove anything here anymore," she said. I met her gaze. "I never did." She nodded, accepting that truth at last. On the drive home, Daniel was quiet. Finally, he said, "I didn't realize how much you carried." I looked out the window, city lights blurring past. I didn't either, not until I put it down. He reached for my hand. "I'm proud of you." For the first time, those words didn't feel like consolation. They felt like partnership. The thing about truth is that it doesn't always roar. Sometimes it settles. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that. Patricia didn't transform into a warm, affectionate mother-in-law overnight. Jessica didn't become introspective and self-aware in a single epiphany. Daniel didn't wake up magically fluent in confrontation. But something fundamental changed. The pressure to perform disappeared. Family dinners became just that, dinners. No rehearsed conversations, no quiet hierarchies, no invisible scorekeeping. I spoke when I had something to say. I stayed silent when I didn't. And for the first time, neither choice felt like self-erasure. Daniel and I grew closer in the aftermath. Not because the conflict was easy, but because we stopped pretending it wasn't there. We talked more, honestly, about boundaries, about loyalty, about the difference between peace and avoidance. "I thought keeping the peace meant staying quiet," he admitted one night, lying beside me. "I thought strength meant enduring," I replied. We were both wrong. Strength, I learned, isn't about volume or dominance. It's about presence, about refusing to disappear so others can stay comfortable. Patricia surprised me one Sunday morning with a simple text. Brunch. No expectations, just pancakes. Pancakes, the universal symbol of surrender. That morning was normal, laughably normal. Sunlight through the windows, coffee refills, Richard making terrible jokes, Jessica rolling her eyes without malice, Patricia actually listening instead of managing. At one point, she turned to me. "I underestimated you," she said plainly. I smiled. Most people do. She didn't argue. Driving home, Daniel reached for my hand. "You changed everything," he said. I shook my head. "No, I just stopped pretending." He smiled. "Same thing. And that's the lesson I want to leave you with. You don't owe silence to people who mistake it for permission. You don't have to perform to deserve respect. And you don't need to raise your voice to be heard. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is tell the truth calmly and let the room adjust around it. Because when you finally stop shrinking, you don't just reclaim your space, you make room for real peace."